I'm Dana Denha, and you're watching FYI. The loss of a loved one fundamentally changes you as a person. Nothing can fill the empty void that has been left from a loss, but grief changes with time. November is Children's Grief Awareness Month, and for kids, the concept of grief can be much harder to comprehend and even harder to communicate. Joining me is Kate Powers, fundraising and branch director for Ellie's Place, Ann Arbor. Welcome to the show, Kate.
Thank you, Dana. I appreciate you having me here today.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about Ellie's Place Ann Arbor and what it's offering?
Absolutely. So, Ellie's Place is actually a statewide children's grief organization. We have locations here in Ann Arbor, also in Lansing and Grand Rapids. We provide peer to peer support for children ages 3 to 18, as well as their adult caregivers. We also provide 8-week school based programs in area middle schools and high schools primarily. And then also the other part of our mission is just providing that outreach and helping people to understand grief in general, but also children's grief. Because as you mentioned, it can be very different for a child who's grieving than it is for one of us as adults. So that's the mission of Ellie's Place. Our vision is to ensure that there are no children who have to grieve alone in the state of Michigan.
Yeah, grief is an interesting thing that when I think about like myself and like that first person I lost when I was a child and
Mhm.
not ever wanting to talk about it and just like internalizing it. And
Yeah.
I feel like that's probably the norm for kids. And even when I think about my own daughter who, she lost her grandfather when she was 3, which is like probably really impossible to comprehend at the time.
Yeah.
And there was no grief that you could see in an adult way the way there was almost nothing in a
Right.
way.
Right. It's interesting. I was speaking with one of our former participants, their mother, and she said she had read that children's grief is like puddle jumping, right? Like you jump in and then you jump back out and you go play or go to school. And I think that that's really very true. I think for a long time there was a belief that children didn't grieve, but we realized that if you are old enough to love and you have the capacity to love someone, you have the capacity to grieve. We also understand that sometimes the individuals that children are grieving are not someone that they loved. It's someone they had a relationship with in their life. And maybe at that time they are angry or sad or scared about that relationship and that person's death. And I think the other thing is, especially for young children, someone who's 3 years old, 5 years old, pretty much up until about the age of 8 or 10, most children don't even understand the permanence of death. And so that's part of the reason why we work really hard here to not only normalize conversation about death and grief, but also utilizing very concrete language. So we don't say that you lost your grandma, because if you lose something, you can find it again. Obviously, when someone dies, that's not an option. And so we try to help children to understand that um, the person is gone, and that's a forever thing. But the memories of that person and the feelings that you have about that person are not gone. And so how do you manage that and move forward in your life?
It's so true. I feel like mentioning this when my daughter was 3, and I kept having to say he's not coming back again. Like even when he was sick, it was like granddad's sick and he's eventually going to die and he's not going to be back. And you do have to be very clear with the things you're saying. You're so right about that. And I think for many of us with children, we don't know what we're doing at first because
Mhm.
we've never dealt with having to help someone so young grieve.
Right.
And it, like I mentioned, it feels so different. Like when I lost my grandmother when I was in my 20s, it felt completely different than when I lost my papa when I was in 3rd grade.
Right. Yes, absolutely. I think the other thing for kids especially is that level of isolation, right? Fortunately, most kindergartners have not experienced the death of someone close to them, whether it's a grandparent, a parent, a sibling. And so they are in an environment day to day where they're not surrounded by people who have a similar experience. And so I think that that's another piece, at least within our program and our model, that is so important, is that we are able to help children come into an environment where it's okay to talk about your grief. It's okay to talk about your person who died. Oftentimes children will avoid talking about that person in their home with their caregiver because their caregiver is oftentimes also grieving that death. And so coming to Ellie's Place or any sort of peer support group that helps children learn coping skills following the death of someone, that's really the key to it, right? Is that you're surrounded by people have um, who have a similar experience. And so I think that's sort of what we say is the magic of what we do, is that even very, very young children have the ability to be with someone who knows what it's like to have someone important to them die.
Do you ever deal with the loss of, because I feel like one of the first things you've, as a human being, if you have pets,
Mhm.
most likely you're going to lose a pet at some point in that childhood, which we've also experienced
Yeah,
here. Do
yeah.
you deal with that at Ellie's place?
So we don't. At Ellie's Place, our primary mission and the work that we do is to support people who have experienced the death of a human. But that isn't to say that we don't have resources and referral opportunities for support groups or organizations that provide that support following the death of a pet. There's a lot of things in children's lives and in adults' lives too that are similar to our do provide a sort of a grieving opportunity, right? And so we do get phone calls from folks who are experiencing divorce, or a child who has had a parent who's become incarcerated, or children going into foster care. And we're so lucky in this community and across the state that we are able to provide resources, whether it's another group that's doing something similar, whether it is just books and age appropriate information that we're able to utilize to share with those children. And so we really want to be that resource for people. While you cannot bring your child here and you can't come here as a family, if you've experienced the death of your pet, but we can help talk you through that, help you find resources. Because yeah, that is really sort of sometimes the first thing that we experience as kids in terms of experiencing something that we love dying.
Yeah, and a pet lives with you. It can feel very much like a family
Yes.
member.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I like that you mentioned books because I feel like that was one of the first avenues that I went to when we knew that her granddad was dying, and I was like, let's read a couple books about what happens and memories and things like that. So that is one of the things that you suggest to people is reading about it too.
Yes, and I think, one of the hard parts as parents, I myself am a parent. I think one of the hard parts is having that language to be able to talk to our kids and wanting to make sure we're doing it right. I think this is a traumatic experience for everyone involved, and we want to lessen that trauma as much as we can. And so the resources that we're able to provide to families, we actually on our website do have a book list that is based on age group, so it's age appropriate. Also, we have a full library of books at our facility here in Ann Arbor that we can recommend to people. And so, yeah, I think books are a great way to do it. There are some television programs. I mean, I know for many years, Sesame Street has sort of been the go-to for, I think, just about everything when
Oh,
you're on
totally. Yeah.
life. And they've actually done a really great job in addressing grief. Not many years ago, they had an entire episode about it, but even recently, I think I saw on TikTok or on Instagram a conversation between Elmo and Andrew Garfield and talking about grief. And so there are, luckily, we're starting to get more and more resources in our community and in our society for people to talk to kids about grief. But when we were founded 33 years ago, there was nothing. I mean, that was part of the reason why folks in the community felt like this was something that needed to be done, because there was lots of opportunity for parents who had lost partners or parents who had lost other children, but for children to be able to be in an environment where they could speak freely about their grief and about the death of someone important to them. It just didn't exist. And so that was really sort of where the impetus for Ellie's Place came from.
Well, and I'm sure as if you deal with death at a young age and then you go to Ellie's place, it probably does help you cope with grief as you get older too, and not have to find that on your own as you grow.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that we really try to instill in the kids that come to our program is that we're providing you coping skills, not just for the death that you're currently grieving, but unfortunately, grief is a great equalizer. And whether you have experienced it or not yet in your life, you will likely. And if you don't, someone who cares about you will experience grief. And so having that opportunity to come into our program at a young age or even at an older age and be able to develop those coping skills so that when it does happen, even if it is, say, for example, a pet, you have the knowledge of ways that you can manage your feelings and emotions.
Well, November is Children's Grief Awareness Month. And I think it's important that we talk about it. Obviously, that's why we're here. But why don't you tell us why it's important? Because, you mentioned that it can feel hard to talk to people that you feel like haven't dealt with it before. But even coming from like the other side of the spectrum, like let's say you had a friend and their parent died and you're best friends with them and you might not feel comfortable having them talk about it because it's scary to think about losing a parent. And I feel like I felt like that once in elementary school. I had a friend whose mother died and I didn't feel comfortable talking to her about it because it was scary to me as a kid.
For sure. Yeah, so November is Children's Grief Awareness Month. It's actually a national month that is promoted by our sort of national organization, the National Alliance for Children's Grief. And so it is a national campaign that we really picked up upon at Ellie's Place, both in Ann Arbor and across the state. And it is just that opportunity for us to talk about children's grief, to help normalize conversations about grief, and to help kids to understand, kids and adults to understand, because I think even for adults, when someone dies, it's very scary and you don't know what to say and you don't want to say the wrong thing. And so just being able to talk about grief in general, I think as a society in the United States, we are not good at talking about grief by any
I would
means.
agree.
And but I think and we're really not great to talking about it when it comes to kids. And I think we oftentimes want to shelter our kids from bad stuff, whether it's occurring within our household because someone close to us has died, or it's occurring in their circle because someone that they know has experienced the death of someone. And so just really helping sort of normalize all of that language, having an understanding of what what are things that you can say to someone who has experienced the death. And we talk about that, all the way from 3 year olds up until 18, 19. We serve young adults as well. And so all the way through about 25, 26 years old. And I think that that is just something really key for all of us in our society. How do I talk to my friend who is grieving the death of someone? And what are the right things to say? What are the wrong things to say? And so in November, being able to do that, we do that through our social media campaigns. You'll keep an eye out. We have billboards all around the Ann Arbor area speaking to Children's Grief Awareness Month, but also talking to folks like you. I think that getting the word out about the fact, one, that we're here, but two, that this is not something that has to be taboo anymore. I think that we need to start talking about feelings and emotions, and I think that November just provides us a really good launch pad to do that all 12 months of the year.
Well, it's one of those things where you, as a grown up, when you're grieving, like I'll bring up my cat that was the second death she had to deal with. And you feel like how much emotion, you think you question these things yourself as a grown up. How much emotion should I be showing about how sad I am about this? But then, like, I did the opposite. I'm like, whatever. Grief is grief. You have
Right.
to go through the stages of grief. If you're really sad about something and you want to cry every day, you can cry about it. You need to get it out. You have to do these things. I mean, for instance, she was even there when we had to put him down. We all were there. We were petting him and stuff like that. And I'm like, I couldn't even imagine having to do that when I was 5 or 6.
Right.
But
Right.
she did it, and she cried tears for him and stuff, and she felt that sadness that we all felt.
Mhm.
But then I felt like she was able to get past it quicker. But I mean, he was my cat. I had him for many years. She was only with him for a few. Do you know what I mean? Like there's a little
Yeah,
bit, but
absolutely.
also like I feel like a child isn't gonna wallow in it forever like that. Like I feel like as a grown up, you need to get through that. It's very much stages for you where you we're talking about that puddle jumping.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the things that we really sort of try to drive home within our program and within our organization as a whole is that all feelings are okay. And so it doesn't really matter when or how you're having those feelings. I think, we have kids who come here and they talk about the guilt that they feel because they're happy. They are having joy in their life, and everyone is expecting them to be sad or crying all the time. And so the fact that, people who are grieving someone do have joy and do have those experiences. And then also, I think the other piece that's important is to understand that while grief certainly comes in waves and goes in different stages, a lot of people talk about the stages of grief. um, you can experience the same stages multiple times in your life regarding
Oh,
this death. And so just understanding that grief is not linear. And I think as human beings, we want it to be linear and we want to deal with it and get over it and move on. And that's just not the way that it works, no matter what or who you're grieving. And so helping kids to understand, we have an activity that we do. Every kid, when they come in, has the opportunity to make a paper doll of themselves. And then we put them on a bridge. And one side of the bridge is cloudy and dark, and there's lightning. And then the other side of the bridge, it's sunshine and it's wonderful. And we ask them when they come in to put their paper doll on the side of the bridge that they're on. And I think it's a great activity for a couple of reasons. First of all, it helps new kids see that you do get to the other side of the bridge, you do get to the sunny side. But also, it helps those children to see you may not stay on the sunny side. You may be in the middle. You may be back in the rainstorm, but that you can get back to the sunny side. And I think that that's really sort of the piece that we're hoping that children will take away from the work that we do is that you may feel very differently every single day about the death and about the person who died, and that's okay. It's perfectly fine to have conflicting and differing emotions on a day-to-day basis. And I think the other piece, because we do provide support to the caregivers, so they are in groups based on the type of death that the family has experienced, whether that's a spouse partner, a child. We have other significant loss groups. We actually run a group specifically for suicide. And the reality is that not only is that a great place for them to sort of bring their emotions to the table, but it's also a place where they are surrounded by other caregivers who are raising and who have grieving children in their home. And so I think that there's a lot of there's we just know there's so much benefit to peer support across the board and helping people to understand that this never ends. The grief will never end, but it will be different and it will be better. And then it may not be better, but that's okay too.
do you want to talk about any, you have your peer-to-peer groups, anything that you offer to these children and their caregivers, as you mentioned, that maybe we didn't hit on yet?
Sure. I think one of the things that we didn't really speak too much about is our school-based programming. So we provide 8-week school groups. Those are done throughout the school day. We partner with the counselor or another mental health professional within the school setting. They're 8 weeks, and students can either self-identify or oftentimes we'll have counselors and social workers who identify kids that might have a need to attend a grief group. And that is really just a great way for us to be able to break down some of those barriers that we run into with families who want to come to our center, but for whatever reason are not able to come here in the evening. And so we're still able to provide programming and support to those kids. And so, I think that's the other piece for us that's really, really so important is what are the ways that we are able to provide grief support that eliminate those barriers? I think certainly during the pandemic, we all figured out interesting ways to do what we needed to do. And we were able to run virtual groups. It's something that we actually did until about a year ago. And now we're looking at specific age groups that might benefit more from a virtual group. So hoping to get our virtual young adult group going back up again um, and just being able to provide the level of support to people who need it, no matter where they are and however they can access us.
Well, you are part of the fundraising committee. How can we support Ellie's Place?
So you can certainly go to our website, www.elliesplace.org. Ellie's is spelled ELES. And during Children's Grief Awareness Month, we are conducting a campaign. We pay as an organization, it costs us about $600 a year for a program to go through, or for a child to go through our program. The programming is completely free to the families that utilize it, and that's really important to us for several reasons. So in November, we asked that folks in our community choose a day and sponsor that day for $600, which allows us to ensure that at a minimum, we have 30 additional spots for children to be able to garner grief support throughout the year.
And then, do you have volunteers or do you need anything along those lines?
We do. So actually, we have a staff of clinical mental health providers who are they oversee our programming, but our programs and our groups are actually run by volunteers. So we have over 100 volunteers every week that come in and help to support the groups that we run. And so we're always looking for volunteers who are interested in running the support groups. Be doing a training in January for those folks. It's a 3-day training, about 24 hours. And then we place individuals in those groups. But we also need folks to come in and help. We have a potluck dinner every night, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. We need folks to come in and help with that. We have office work that we always need support and help with. We have a beautiful facility, but certainly could use help in making sure that that's maintained and that our gardens look lovely. So there's plenty of volunteer opportunities at Ellie's Place. On our website, also, there are ways to volunteer and there's a form to fill out. And when you do that, it'll get to our volunteer coordinator and she will ensure that you're able to get the kind of information that you need to come and help us out.
It sounds like a very rewarding volunteer opportunity that you could be helping children going through loss. I mean, we all know that's so tough for everybody, but if you could be there, that person that helps, it's got to feel pretty amazing.
I think so. And actually, we now, we've been in Ann Arbor for 17 years. We've been in the state of Michigan for 33. We're now seeing adults who utilized our program as children coming back and volunteering their time as facilitators, which is really just amazing and fantastic. And, who better to support those kids than somebody who's been in their shoes?
Well, we've already talked about this, but before we go, why should people take advantage of Ellie's Place when they are going through grief?
The biggest piece is that grief is so isolating. And I think loneliness and feeling alone is one of the biggest emotions that oftentimes people feel. I think the other thing is that when someone dies, oftentimes you have a lot of support from your community in the immediate. People are bringing dinner, people are reaching out, calling, and unfortunately, that doesn't last forever. And so, coming to Ellie's Place provides a continued level of support and creates a community that I think folks really need when they are having that experience. And I think the other piece of it is that we know that unresolved childhood grief can bring about a lot of dangerous behaviors in adulthood. And so we would love to be able to mitigate those as much as possible. And by coming to our program, just learning those coping skills, I think kids really just have a better shot.
Yeah, I would agree. Yes. And like I said, this is just going to help you as you grow because grief is something that's so hard to understand when you really start experiencing it and
Mhm.
going through it. And one of the things that I wanted to mention, and I don't know if this is something that you talk about, but you mentioned that you have community support right when someone passes or dies. And that's so true. Everyone, your neighbors, everybody wants to bring you food and do all this stuff. One of the things I've noticed is that a lot of times after some time has passed, people don't want to mention that person to you anymore. And so, for instance, I have a neighbor whose her husband died and she has two kids. And I always try to make it a point when the son comes over to play in our yard, and I'll say, "Oh, your dad used to do this, and your dad used to do that."
Yeah,
And I'm like, I hope he likes that I mentioned his dad because I feel like a lot of times people just feel like, oh, well, I don't want to make them sad, so I don't want to talk about the person that passed. But it's actually like the opposite, and I think it makes them feel good that people think about that person still, even
right.
though maybe I wasn't the closest to his dad, but I knew some stuff about his dad.
Yeah,
Just stuff like that. Just keeping those lines open because that person was real and they meant something to a lot of people.
exactly. And those memories are huge. And I think a lot of times people are, you know, we talk a lot about grief and we talk a lot about death, but we also talk about the person and we celebrate the person and talk about birthdays and we talk about the anniversaries of the day they died and really just remembering who they were and how they were important to that person is so key because if you think about it, their death was a very, very small part of their life. And so being able to remember their whole life is so key for those families. And I think sometimes people are afraid that they don't want to make someone upset or make someone sad. And the reality is that the person is already grieving, and you bringing up the person who died is not going to make that worse. The grief is already there. And in fact, in our experience, oftentimes talking about the person is one of the best conversations that a person can have in a day.
I agree. Well, thank you, Kate, for coming on the show. This is such an important topic, and I think it's great to just sort of lift the veil on grief because we all deal with it. Like you said, almost everyone will deal with some sort of grief in their life at some point, and it's going to be the hardest thing and the most ongoing issue you have, but
Mhm.
it gets better. You have good days and you have bad days, and it's great to talk about.
Thank you, Dana. I'm grateful to be here.
For more on this and other programs, visit a2gov.org/CTN. Visit youtube.com/CTN Ann Arbor to see all that we have to offer. And remember to like, subscribe, and ring that notification. Thanks for watching and tune in next time to FYI.